Welcome to Last Minute Lecture. This free chapter overview is designed to help students review and understand key concepts. These summaries supplement, not replace, the original textbook and may not be redistributed or resold. For complete coverage, always consult the official text.
Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there is this really comforting expectation of precision.
Oh yeah, like engineering.
Exactly. It's like you fall off your bike, your arm hurts, you go to the hospital, and the x-ray shows that jagged white line across the bone.
Right. The doctor just points at the screen and says, well, there it is, broken radius.
Yeah. It's entirely binary. It's either broken or it's not. It's clean. It's visible. And there's this undeniable relief in being able to just physically point to the problem.
But the moment you step into the world of human behavior or, emotions and mental processes, that whole metaphorical x-ray machine just shatters.
It really does. We start looking at a diagnostic landscape that is just incredibly murky. I mean, we are dealing with pain you can't always photograph.
Which is honestly arguably the most fascinating terrain we can explore.
Oh, totally.
Because when we lose the ability to just point at a broken bone, we are forced to ask these fundamental questions about who we are.
Right. And that is exactly what we are doing today. Welcome to this special deep dive. We are essentially acting as your personal tutors today.
Yes, we are.
Our mission is to take you on a really thorough exploration of Unit 12, which covers abnormal psychology, straight from Meyer Psychology for AP, the first edition.
It's such a foundational unit.
Yeah.
And there is this brilliant idea put forward by the pioneering psychologist William James that really sets the stage here.
Oh, I love this quote.
Yeah, he observed that to study the abnormal is the best way of understanding the normal.
Wow. Yeah, that's powerful.
Because we aren't looking at some alien phenomenon when we look at psychological disorders. We're basically looking at everyday human traits, anxiety, sadness, suspicion, fear.
Just amplified or distorted or prolonged.
Exactly.
And that eerie sense of self-recognition is what makes this unit so compelling because, let's be honest, you, me, everyone listening, we've all felt anxious.
Yeah.
We've all felt deeply sad. It is this profoundly universal human experience.
Yeah.
And the sheer scale of it is staggering.
It really is.
I mean, when you look at the data from the World Health Organization, we are talking about 450 million people worldwide suffering from mental or behavioral disorders.
It's an immense number. And when you quantify the impact, it accounts for over 15% of the years of life lost due to death or disability globally.
Wait, 15%?
Yeah. To put that in perspective, that is slightly below the toll of cardiovascular conditions and actually slightly above the impact of cancer.
That is wild. It touches every society, every culture, every demographic.
Right. Which brings us to the foundational question of this entire deep dive. If we all experience these emotions, if sadness and anxiety are just, part of the human condition, where do we draw the line?
Yeah, how do we determine the boundary between a normal, healthy reaction like profound grief after losing a loved one and an actual psychological disorder?
That is the defining question. And the psychological community relies on a really specific framework to answer it. Clinicians don't just look for isolated moments of distress.
Right, everyone has a bad day.
Exactly. They look for deeply entrenched patterns, specifically patterns of thoughts, feelings, or behaviors that meet three distinct criteria. You can think of them as the 3Ds.
Okay, the 3Ds, let's hear them.
The behavior must be deviant, distressful, and dysfunctional. All three must be present to cross that threshold into a disorder.
Okay, let's unpack this framework, starting with that first word, deviant. Because I want to push back on this a bit.
Sure.
Simply being different or statistically unusual cannot be a disorder. If we look at an Olympic gold medalist, right, say a gymnast, doing things in the air that literally defy gravity.
Yeah.
Their physical abilities are wildly deviant from the norm, but we don't diagnose them with a disorder. We put them on a cereal box. We give them a medal.
That is a crucial distinction. Statistical rarity is not the same as psychological deviance. In this context, deviant refers to behaving differently from what is acceptable or expected within your specific culture and your specific context.
Okay, so context matter.
Context is the ultimate filter. Take the act of mass killing. In the context of a battlefield during wartime, that behavior might be viewed by society as normal or necessary or even heroic.
Sad but true.
But take that exact same behavior and place it in a civilian setting during peacetime, and it is instantly recognized as deranged and dangerously deviant.
And it's not just the immediate situation, it's the broader culture, right? The society you live in basically dictates the baseline of reality.
Absolutely. The cultural lens changes everything. If you live in a modern, secular Western society and you earnestly tell your coworkers that you regularly hear and speak to the voices of the dead, that is going to be classified as highly deviant.
The clinician would definitely flag that.
Yeah, as a potential auditory hallucination. However, if you belong to a culture that actively practices ancestor worship, claiming to communicate with the dead is not seen as disordered in the slightest.
Oh, right.
It is considered a rational, perhaps even spiritually elevated behavior.
It's just a moving target because, society changes its mind over time, too. Behaviors that were universally condemned 50 years ago are celebrated today and vice versa. Like, there was a time not so long ago when the psychiatric establishment classified homosexuality as a mental illness.
Yes.
It wasn't until the early 1970s that the American Psychiatric Association removed it from their manual. And that was simply because societal norms and scientific understanding evolved. The deviance just evaporated because the culture changed.
Precisely. And that fluidity is exactly why deviance alone is never enough for a diagnosis. Being different doesn't make you sick. The behavior only crosses into disorder territory if that deviance causes the individual profound internal distress and if it leads to dysfunction in their daily life.
Okay, let's ground this with a real-world example so you can really see how the 3Ds interact. Consider a guy who has severe obsessive-compulsive tendencies regarding cleanliness. Let's say every single Sunday, he spends 5 hours cleaning his bedroom. He takes every single book off the shelf, dusts it, and places it back in an exact order. His clothes have to hang exactly 2 fingers apart on the closet rod.
Well, that level of rigid, time-consuming repetition definitely fulfills the deviant criteria.
Yeah.
It is well outside the cultural norm for just tidying up.
Right.
But the second D, distress, is where the internal reality of the disorder becomes apparent. If you were to ask him about this routine, he wouldn't say he enjoys it.
He's not just having fun organizing.
No, he would likely tell you that if he tries to stop, he is flooded with intense, unyielding anxiety. He might have this haunting feeling that something catastrophic will happen to his family if the books aren't perfectly aligned. He is tormented by his own compulsions.
And then the third D, dysfunction. This isn't just a quirky habit. It's a harmful dysfunction. Spending 5 hours every Sunday doing this impairs his life.
Yes, severely.
It ruins his weekend. It strains his relationships. It drains his energy for work. That's the mechanism of a disorder. You might have an intense, deviant fear of snakes, but if you live in a high-rise apartment in a major city, that fear doesn't impair your life. You aren't dysfunctional.
Right.
But if your dream is to be a wildlife biologist, and you can't even look at a photo of a reptile without having a panic attack, well, now your fear is a harmful dysfunction.
Exactly. It's the intersection of the abnormal, the painful, and the paralyzing.
Yeah.
But arriving at this really nuanced 3-part definition took a long time.
Oh, a very long.
If we trace how humanity has tried to understand and treat abnormal behavior throughout history, it is just a harrowing journey. The evolution of our understanding reveals a lot about human nature itself.
It really does, and the early history is unbelievably dark. Because before we had any concept of brain chemistry or psychology, human beings still needed to explain why someone was suddenly acting erratically or hallucinating.
Right, they had to make sense of it somehow.
Exactly. In the Middle Ages, the dominant framework was entirely supernatural. If you exhibited signs of a psychological disorder, the community presumed it was the work of strange cosmic forces.
Like, maybe the stars were aligned wrong.
Or you were cursed by godlike powers, or most commonly, you were possessed by a demon.
And because their underlying theory of why the behavior was happening was supernatural, their methods of treatment were just barbaric.
Yeah, it's hard to even think about.
If you believe a demon is inside a person, your goal is to make the body an inhospitable place for that demon.
Which led to practices like trephination. We have actual archaeological evidence of this. Skulls with crude holes drilled straight through the bone.
Literally drilling a hole in a person's heart.
Yes, to give the evil spirits an exit route. It's terrifying.
And if they didn't drill your skull, they might just cage you like an animal in a primitive asylum. Patients were subjected to beatings, burnings, castration, or just being chained to walls in absolute filth. It was an era of profound cruelty born out of profound ignorance.
But then, in the late 1700s, we finally get a massive paradigm shift. This was largely championed by a French physician named Philippe Pinel.
Pinel was a true visionary. He looked at the horrors of the asylums and argued that madness was not demon possession.
Right.
He proposed that it was a sickness of the mind, fundamentally caused by severe stress and inhumane living conditions.
It just makes so much sense.
He pushed for what he called moral treatment. This meant unchaining the patients.
Yeah.
It meant actually talking to them, replacing dungeon-like filth with clean air and sunshine, and substituting brutality with gentleness and activity.
It sounds so incredibly obvious to us today, but in that era, it was a revolutionary act of empathy. And Pinel's shift in perspective essentially laid the groundwork for a massive scientific breakthrough that happened in the 1800s.
This is a huge turning point.
It really is. Researchers discovered that syphilis, which is a physical, sexually transmitted infection, can actually invade the brain and cause severe mental distortions, hallucinations, and erratic behavior.
This was the ultimate light bulb moment for the medical community. It established a direct, undeniable link between biology and behavior.
Yes.
If a physical disease like syphilis could cause psychiatric symptoms, the logic followed that perhaps all mental disorders had physical biological causes.
And this births the medical model. This is the perspective that mental illnesses are exactly that, illnesses. They are psychopathologies that need to be diagnosed based on symptoms and cured through medical intervention, often in a hospital setting.
It completely overhauled our vocabulary. Think about how we talk about mental health today. We use terms like illness, diagnosis, symptoms, therapy, and patient.
Yeah, that is all the legacy of the medical model.
Now, the medical model was a crucial step forward, especially as it paved the way for our modern understanding of genetics and brain biochemistry. But as comprehensive as it seems, treating psychological disorders strictly like physical diseases, like a broken arm or a bacterial infection, is incomplete.
Right.
A pure biological approach misses the context of the human experience.
Yeah, because if I have a bacterial infection, it honestly doesn't matter if I'm stressed out at work or if I had a happy childhood. The bacteria is just going to do its thing.
Exactly.
But with mental health, you can't separate the mind from the environment.
Which is why the modern consensus relies on the biopsychosocial approach. It's a holistic view, acknowledging that mind and body are inseparable.
So it's biology, psychology, and society all mashed together.
Exactly. Every psychological disorder arises from a complex intersection of three domains. First, biological influences.
Yeah.
Your genetic predispositions, your brain structure, your neurochemistry.
Okay, that's the bio part.
Second, psychological influences. Your trauma history, your stress levels, your patterns of learned helplessness. And third, social cultural influences. The expectations of your society, the roles you are forced to play, and your environment.
And the ultimate proof that the environment shapes the disorder is the existence of culture-bound syndromes. I mean, if mental illness was purely a biological broken part, it would manifest the exact same way universally.
But it doesn't.
No, it doesn't. Take a condition known as susto, which is prevalent in some Latin American cultures. It involves severe anxiety, restlessness, and a deep fear that one's soul has been detached from the body, often tied to a fear of black magic.
Wow. Or look at Taijin Kyofusho in Japan. This is a profound social anxiety, but it's specifically focused on an intense fear of displeasing or embarrassing others with one's appearance or body odor. It comes with a readiness to blush and a paralyzing fear of eye contact.
Now, obviously, devastating conditions like major depression and schizophrenia exist across all cultures worldwide. But the specific flavor of distress, the way it presents itself, is heavily molded by the culture you live in.
It really highlights how the biopsychosocial model forces us to realize that we aren't just looking for a biological glitch to fix with a pill. We have to look at the whole person, their interpretations of life, and the world they inhabit.
Exactly. But to treat these incredibly complex, multifaceted disorders, the psychiatric community first needs to be able to talk about them. They need a shared language and a standardized way to classify them.
Which brings us to the power, and frankly, the peril of labels.
In biology, classification is straightforward, right? If you tell me an animal is a mammal, I instantly know it is warm-blooded, it has hair, and it produces milk for its young. It's an efficient shorthand. But how do you classify the infinite variations of the human mind?
The primary tool for this in psychology and psychiatry is the DSM. And at the time of this deep dive's focus, we're looking at the DSM-IVTR.
Okay, let's unpack that acronym.
It stands for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 4th edition text revision. It is essentially the encyclopedia of abnormal behavior. It outlines a strict diagnostic process and categorizes 16 major clinical syndromes.
So it's designed to remove the guesswork. Instead of a doctor just going on their gut feeling, the manual provides objective, specific questions about observable behaviors. It actually requires a clinician to check off certain criteria before they can officially hand down a diagnosis.
And in terms of consistency, it is highly reliable. Studies have shown that when clinicians use the DSM's structured interview techniques, the agreement rate is remarkable.
How remarkable.
Well, in one major study, when a second psychologist independently reviewed videotapes of patient interviews, they agreed with the first psychologist's diagnosis 83% of the time.
Oh, wow. That is high.
That level of reliability is crucial not just for treatment, but for the logistics of healthcare. In North America, insurance companies almost universally require a specific DSM diagnosis before they will authorize payment for therapy.
But, and this is a big but, this immense reliance on the DSM is not without serious controversy. I have to push back on this system because it feels like this manual is casting an incredibly wide net.
It's a huge debate.
The evolution of the DSM itself is telling. In the 1950s, the manual had around 60 diagnostic categories. Today, it has swelled to over 400.
Yeah, that's a massive increase.
And as a result, we are looking at statistics indicating that roughly half of all adults will meet the criteria for at least one psychological disorder at some point in their lives. Half.
It is one of the most heated debates in the field. Are we discovering more disorders, or are we simply pathologizing normal human struggles? Critics of the DSM argue that we are taking everyday problems like grief, rebelliousness, eccentricity, and turning them into psychiatric illnesses.
The impact on children is especially alarming to me. We've seen diagnoses in kids absolutely mushroom. Normal childhood behaviors are getting medicalized.
Yes.
A kid throwing temper tantrums and arguing with their parents might get slapped with the label of oppositional defiant disorder. Kids who are naturally fidgety and impulsive are funneled into an ADHD diagnosis. Even adolescent mood swings, which we all know are fueled by hormones and just growing up, are increasingly being diagnosed as pediatric bipolar disorder.
It raises the terrifying prospect that the label itself might be more damaging than the behavior it describes. Labels create preconceptions. They act as cognitive filters that basically warp how we view a person.
And nothing proves the distorting power of labels better than the legendary David Rosenhan study from 1973. This is one of those studies that fundamentally shakes your faith in the system.
Oh, it's wild. Tell them about it.
So Rosenhan and 7 other perfectly sane, healthy people decided to test the validity of psychiatric diagnoses. They went to the admissions offices of various psychiatric hospitals. They used false names and professions, but everything else they said was completely truthful.
Every other detail of their life.
Right, but they complained of exactly one fake symptom. They said they were hearing voices that said the words empty, hollow, and thud.
That was the entirety of their symptom presentation. Just those 3 words.
Yep. And based on that alone, all 8 of these sane individuals were admitted to the hospitals and all were misdiagnosed with severe psychological disorders, mostly schizophrenia.
Now, to be fair to the clinicians, if you walk into an emergency room and fake a symptom, like, say, coughing up blood, you can't really blame the doctor for diagnosing you with a severe ulcer or a lung issue. They have to operate on the assumption that the patient is telling the truth.
Okay, that's a fair defense for the initial admission, but the real shocker is what happened after they were admitted.
Okay.
The moment they hit the psychiatric ward, they dropped the symptom. They never complained of hearing voices again. They acted completely normal. They were friendly. They answered all life history questions truthfully. They were in these hospitals for an average of 19 days.
And this is where the peril of the label becomes undeniable. Once that label of schizophrenia was attached to their chart, the staff became functionally blind to their sanity.
It's terrifying.
The clinicians looked back at their completely normal life histories and suddenly discovered the supposed root causes of their illness in perfectly ordinary childhood events. Everything they did was viewed through the lens of the disorder.
Yes, even something as mundane as taking notes. The pseudo-patients were given notebooks to record their experiences for the study. The nursing staff didn't see people doing research.
Yeah, of course not.
They documented the action as patient engages in writing behavior, framing it as a psychiatric compulsion. The label became a self-fulfilling prophecy.
It's systemic confirmation bias. If you expect a person to be hostile or erratic because of their label, you might treat them coldly or with suspicion. They, in turn, react to your coldness with perfectly normal frustration or hostility, and boom, your preconception is confirmed. You say, see, it's the disorder.
We also can't ignore the immense social stigma attached to these labels. While it's true that public figures speaking openly about their struggles with depression or anxiety has helped normalize the conversation a bit, the media stereotypes absolutely linger.
Very much so.
If you watch movies or television, people with psychological disorders are overwhelmingly portrayed as unpredictable, violent, or homicidal.
Which is a tragic distortion of reality. The factual data is crystal clear here. The vast majority of people diagnosed with mental disorders are completely nonviolent.
Completely.
In reality, individuals struggling with severe psychological disorders are far more likely to be the victims of violence, abuse, and exploitation than the perpetrators of it.
That is such a critical truth to anchor ourselves to as we dive into the specific conditions. So keeping the power, the mechanics, and the stigma of labels in mind, let's explore the actual disorders. We're going to start with an emotion every single person listening has experienced, but one that can spiral into a paralyzing force: anxiety.
Anxiety is a fundamental survival mechanism. We all feel it before a high-stakes moment, like a big speech, a job interview, or a final exam. It sharpens our focus. But anxiety crosses the line into a disorder when it becomes distressing, persistent, and leads to dysfunctional behaviors aimed at reducing that very anxiety.
And there are 5 main types to understand, right?
Yes, starting with generalized anxiety disorder, or GAD.
GAD is insidious. It is characterized by a person being unexplainably and continually tense and uneasy. It's an autonomic nervous system that just won't turn off.
Yeah.
Think about a 27-year-old who suffers from dizziness, sweating palms, and heart palpitations. He has no physical illness, yet he is constantly jittery, chronically sleep-deprived, and his mind is just a treadmill of worry. He worries about money, then immediately worries about his health, then worries about his family.
Sigmund Freud had a brilliant term for this. He called it free-floating anxiety. And that is perhaps the most tormenting aspect of GAD. The person cannot identify the root cause of their tension. Because it is free-floating and not tied to a specific threat, like, a bear in the woods, they can't deal with it, fight it, or avoid it. It is a persistent, low-level hum of physiological arousal.
I always think if GAD is like a pot of water constantly simmering on the stove, like always hot, always bubbling, then panic disorder is that pot suddenly boiling over and splashing everywhere. Panic disorder is an anxiety tornado.
I like that analogy because it captures the sudden, explosive nature of the condition. In panic disorder, that simmering anxiety suddenly escalates into a terrifying panic attack. This isn't just feeling stressed. This is a minutes-long episode of intense, overwhelming dread.
It's physical.
Highly physical. The symptoms are severe. Heart palpitations, shortness of breath, a choking sensation, dizziness, and trembling. It is so intense that people experiencing their first panic attack frequently rush to the emergency room, absolutely convinced they are having a fatal heart attack.
And there are biological amplifiers here too. Smokers, for example, have at least a doubled risk of developing panic disorder.
Wow, really?
Yeah. Why? Because nicotine is a stimulant. If your nervous system is already prone to redlining, pumping a stimulant into it just revs up that physiological arousal and primes the pump for an attack.
That makes total sense. And what often happens next is this cascading effect. Because these panic attacks strike unpredictably, the individual develops a secondary debilitating fear. The fear of the fear itself.
They anticipate.
Exactly. They become terrified of having an attack in a public place where escape might be difficult or embarrassing. This can lead to agoraphobia,
which literally shapes how they live their lives. They start avoiding crowds, buses, airplanes, and in severe cases, they stop leaving their homes entirely. The evolutionary biologist Charles Darwin is actually a famous historical example of this.
Oh, wait.
He suffered from severe panic attacks and agoraphobia. He eventually moved out to the country and lived in relative seclusion just to avoid the social gatherings that triggered his overwhelming panic.
Now, contrast that free-floating, unpredictable anxiety with phobias. Phobias are highly specific. A phobia is an irrational fear that causes a person to intensely avoid a specific object, activity, or situation.
But we have to distinguish between a normal fear and a phobic disorder. Plenty of people are afraid of heights or get creeped out by spiders. A phobia is when that fear becomes incapacitating and completely dictates your behavior. Imagine someone so terrified of thunderstorms that they don't just feel nervous when it rains. They hide in a windowless basement and have to call a relative to stay with them if a storm is merely forecast on the news while they are home alone.
Yeah.
The fear hijacks their reality.
It extends to social situations, too, with social phobia. This isn't just introversion or being shy. It is an extreme, paralyzing fear of being scrutinized or judged by others.
Like public speaking gone wrong.
Worse, it can lead to intense physical reactions, sweating, trembling, nausea, if the person just has to speak up in a meeting or even eat in a public restaurant.
Okay, that brings us to a condition that gets casually referenced all the time, but is profoundly misunderstood: obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD.
People joke about it constantly.
All the time. People joke, oh, I like my desk neat, I'm so OCD, but that completely minimizes the disorder. Everyone has occasional repetitive thoughts or double checks to make sure they lock the front door. OCD is when the thoughts become a haunting obsession and the behaviors become a senseless, time-consuming compulsion.
To understand the mechanics of OCD, we have to separate the thoughts from the actions.
Right.
The obsessions are the repetitive, intrusive, unwanted thoughts. They are the terrifying mental images or worries that just won't go away. The compulsions are the repetitive behaviors or actions the person feels driven to perform to alleviate the anxiety caused by the obsession.
Let's break down that mechanism. Having a passing thought about germs on a doorknob is normal. Being haunted by the obsession that you are contaminated and will spread a deadly disease to your family, that is the obsession. To reduce that screaming anxiety, you wash your hands. That's the compulsion.
But the relief is fleeting.
Exactly. The relief is fleeting. The obsession returns, so you wash them again and again, to the point where your skin is raw, bleeding, and you are spending 3 hours a day at the sink, entirely unable to go to work. The compulsion is an attempt to exert control over the terrifying obsession.
Which segues into the fifth major anxiety disorder, one fundamentally rooted in extreme external trauma: post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. We frequently discuss this in the context of combat veterans, but it also heavily impacts survivors of severe accidents, natural disasters, or sexual assaults.
PTSD is characterized by lingering, intrusive memories, terrifying nightmares, jumpy anxiety, social withdrawal, and severe insomnia. And importantly, to meet the diagnostic criteria, these symptoms must persist for 4 weeks or more after a severely threatening, uncontrollable event.
So it isn't just a tough couple of days after a car crash.
No, it's a profound altering of the nervous system.
For instance, a combat veteran who returns home might suffer terrible flashback triggered by something as simple as a car backfiring, which transports their mind and body entirely back to a war zone. The prevalence after mass trauma is staggering. Following the September 11th attacks, roughly 20% of people who live near the World Trade Center reported symptoms of PTSD.
But, that statistic leads to a fascinating, crucial question. 20% develop PTSD, which means 80% didn't. Half of all adults will experience a traumatic event in their lifetime, but only about 1 in 10 women and 1 in 20 men develop PTSD. Why are some people so vulnerable while others walk away from the same wreckage relatively intact?
Biology plays a massive role here. Researchers have found that individuals who develop PTSD often have a highly sensitive limbic system, which is the emotional processing center of the brain.
Okay.
When they experience trauma, this sensitive system basically floods the body with stress hormones and then struggles to turn the alarm off.
And there is a clear genetic vulnerability. If you look at twin studies, if one identical twin experiences heavy combat and develops the cognitive difficulties and emotional scarring associated with PTSD, their non-combat twin often shares those exact same cognitive risk factors. The biological blueprint was just primed for it.
Yet we really must highlight the phenomenon of survivor resiliency. The human capacity to endure is remarkable. The vast majority of people subjected to trauma do not develop PTSD. In fact, psychologists studying Holocaust survivors, people who endured the absolute worst of human atrocities like Peter Sudfeld and Irvin Staub, found that many went on to live highly productive, deeply meaningful lives.
Staub actually coined a beautiful phrase for this. He called it altruism born of suffering.
Yes, and it points to a concept known as post-traumatic growth. It is the idea that struggling with unimaginable crises can actually lead to a deeper appreciation for life, a profound shift in priorities, more meaningful relationships, and an enlarged capacity for empathy. It is proof that the mind doesn't just shatter under pressure. It has an incredible ability to rebuild and find meaning.
So if we step back, how do psychologists fundamentally explain why these various anxiety disorders take hold? We can look at this through 2 primary lenses: the learning perspective and the biological perspective. Let's tackle learning first. This takes us back to the mechanics of conditioning.
Right. Classical conditioning is a powerful engine for anxiety. It explains how we learn to associate a previously neutral stimulus with a terrifying event.
Like the little Albert experiment.
Exactly. Think about that famous, albeit unethical, little Albert experiment, where a baby was conditioned to fear a white rat after it was repeatedly paired with a loud, terrifying noise. Or consider laboratory research, where rats are given unpredictable electric shocks. They become chronically anxious and ulcer-prone because they learn that the environment is inherently dangerous, even when the shocks stop.
In human terms, if you are driving over a bridge and get into a horrifying car accident, your brain links the bridge with the terror. But it doesn't stop there. Through a process called stimulus generalization, your brain might broaden the fear. You might develop a conditioned fear of all bridges, then all elevated roads, then all driving entirely.
And once the fear is conditioned, operant conditioning, specifically negative reinforcement, locks it in place. This is how phobias and compulsions are maintained.
Let me explain that mechanism, because it's brilliant but insidious. Let's say you have a conditioned phobia of elevators. You approach an elevator, your heart rate spikes, your palms sweat, you feel terrified. So you turn around and take the stairs.
Okay, what happens next?
The moment you decide to take the stairs, your anxiety drops. That drop in anxiety feels good. It is a reward. By removing the negative feeling, you have negatively reinforced the behavior of avoiding elevators. Your brain learns, avoiding elevators keeps me safe. So the next time, the urge to avoid it is even stronger.
That makes perfect sense.
And the exact same mechanism drives the hand washing in OCD. The compulsion relieves the anxiety, reinforcing the compulsion.
We can also bypass direct experience entirely and learn fear through observational learning. You don't have to be bitten by a dog to fear dogs. You just have to watch your parent react with sheer terror every time a dog approaches. Susan Maneka demonstrated this beautifully with wild monkeys.
And the monkey study.
Yeah. She showed that lab-reared monkeys who had never seen a snake instantly developed a terror of snakes simply by watching a wild-reared monkey react with fear. Fear is contagious.
But learning theory has a massive blind spot. If anxiety is purely learned, we should be equally terrified of anything that hurts us. But we aren't. Why are some things so much easier to become a phobic about than others?
That's where the biological evolutionary perspective steps in. We are genetically, evolutionarily prepared to fear specific threats.
It's ancestral baggage.
Exactly. Human beings easily develop phobias of spiders, snakes, heights, and enclosed spaces. Why? Because hundreds of thousands of years ago, the early humans who lacked a healthy terror of venomous snakes and steep cliff didn't live long enough to pass on their genes. We are the descendants of the terrified.
I love that phrase. And the inverse proves the rule. We rarely develop phobias of modern, highly lethal threats like dropping bombs or electricity or cars. During the Blitzkrieg air raids of World War II, people obviously feared the bombs, but they didn't become phobic. They actually became remarkably indifferent to the planes over time.
Right, because evolution simply hasn't had enough time to wire our brains to instinctively fear things that fall from the sky or move at 70 miles per hour on a highway.
Furthermore, the biological perspective points to the actual wiring and chemistry of the brain. Anxiety runs in families. If one identical twin has an anxiety disorder, the other is at a significantly higher risk, even if they were raised apart.
And we can actually see the biological misfire in brain scans. Let's go back to OCD. There is a region in the brain called the anterior cingulate cortex. Its normal job is to monitor our actions and check for errors.
It's like the brain's internal typo checker.
Yes. If you type the wrong word, it fires to say, hey, fix that. In people with OCD, this area is hyperactive. The error-checking mechanism is jammed in the on position, so the person locks the front door. The logical brain knows the door is locked. But the hyperactive anterior cingulate cortex screams, error, danger, the door is unlocked.
Wow.
It creates an overwhelming cognitive dissonance, forcing the person to check it again and again. It is a biological glitch driving a psychological compulsion.
It perfectly illustrates how deeply intertwined our biology and our learned experiences are. But anxiety is a disorder where the mind spins out of control. What happens when psychological distress is so overwhelming that it seemingly bypasses the conscious mind entirely and offloads that pain into the physical body? Or, even more extremely, what happens when the mind fractures itself to survive? This brings us to a really fascinating category: somatoform and dissociative disorders.
Let's start with somatoform disorders. The prefix soma means body. These are disorders where deeply distressing psychological symptoms take a bodily somatic form without any apparent physical cause. It's crucial to understand that the patient is not faking it. The pain, the paralysis, the nausea is completely real to them. But when medical doctors run every test, They cannot find a neurological or physiological explanation.
Cultural context dictates so much of this. In many Western cultures, it is socially acceptable to say, I'm deeply depressed and anxious. But in other parts of the world, like in China, expressing psychological distress is often viewed as socially unacceptable or shameful.
So the mind has to find another outlet.
Exactly. So the mind translates that psychological distress into culturally acceptable somatic complaints, like severe physical exhaustion or chronic stomach pain. A technician in China experiencing profound depression might be treated entirely for insomnia and fatigue because the body is carrying the weight of the mind.
There are two specific somatoform disorders that illustrate this mind-body translation perfectly. The first is conversion disorder. It is relatively rare today, but it was incredibly common during Freud's era. This is a condition where severe anxiety is essentially converted into a physical symptom that makes absolutely no neurological sense.
A person might suddenly develop unexplained paralysis in their arm or completely lose their vision. But the strange part, and this is a hallmark of the disorder, is they might display a bizarre indifference to this sudden catastrophic physical problem.
Right.
A doctor could stick a pin into the paralyzed arm, and the patient produces no physical response, even though all the nerve pathways are perfectly intact. The brain is literally shutting off the signal to protect itself from underlying anxiety.
The second, much more common type is hypochondriasis. This is not just worrying about your health. This is when a person misinterprets entirely normal physical sensations, like a minor stomach cramp, a slight headache, a twitching muscle, as the undeniable symptoms of a dreaded fatal disease.
And the defining feature is that no amount of medical reassurance works.
Right.
They go to a doctor, the doctor runs an MRI, does blood work, and says, you are perfectly healthy. The patient doesn't feel relief. They just assume the doctor is incompetent. They move from doctor to doctor, trapped in a cycle of somatic terror.
So the somatoform disorders show the mind affecting the body. But dissociative disorders involve the mind affecting its very structure. These are profound, terrifying disruptions of consciousness, memory, or identity. Dissociation is essentially the mind's ultimate defense mechanism. When a situation is overwhelmingly stressful or painful, the conscious awareness separates or dissociates from those painful memories or thoughts.
It's like pulling the plug on a computer to stop a virus from destroying the hard drive. You just go dark.
Perfect analogy.
We see extreme examples of this in fugue states. There was a documented case of a man who survived the 9/11 attacks. The trauma was so immense that his mind just blanked. He lost all memory of his personal identity, walked away from his life, and disappeared for 6 months, living under a completely different identity until his original memories slowly resurfaced.
But the most bewilderment and the most fierce debate in the psychological community surrounds dissociative identity disorder, or DID. You might know it by its older name, multiple personality disorder.
This is the massive, catastrophic splintering of the self. A person with DID exhibits 2 or more distinct, alternating identities that control their behavior. These alters can have different voices, different mannerisms, different postures, and typically, the original primary personality vehemently denies any awareness of the others.
The controversy over DID is intense, and it was perfectly encapsulated by the chilling case of Kenneth Bianchi, known as the Hillside Strangler.
Oh, that case is crazy.
Bianchi was a brutal serial killer. But during a psychological evaluation involving hypnosis, the psychologist essentially called forth a hidden personality. Bianchi's demeanor shifted, and he claimed his name was Steve. Steve coldly confessed to the murders and stated that Ken was weak and knew absolutely nothing about the killings.
It created an incredible legal and psychiatric puzzle. Was Bianchi suffering from a genuine, profound psychiatric break, meaning he wasn't legally culpable for what his alter did? Or was he a highly manipulative, clever con artist using a sensational psychological theory to beat a murder rap?
Skeptics of DID point to cases exactly like Bianchi's to argue that the disorder is largely a mirage. Researchers like Nicholas Manos argue that DID might just be an extreme version of normal human role-playing. We all act differently at a party than we do at a funeral. What if DID is just vulnerable people leaning into a role?
And Spanos proved how easily this could be induced. He conducted an experiment where he asked normal college students to pretend they were accused murderers undergoing a psychiatric examination. Under hypnosis, a significant portion of these completely healthy students spontaneously generated a second distinct personality to take the blame. Skeptics argue that highly hypnotizable, vulnerable patients are basically acting out a fantasy that is inadvertently suggested to them by their therapists.
And the epidemiological data heavily supports the skeptics. Between 1930 and 1960, there were maybe 2 documented cases of DID per decade in North America. It was incredibly rare. Then, in the 1980s, the DSM formally recognized it. Suddenly, the number of cases exploded to over 20,000. Furthermore, the disorder is almost non-existent in places like India and Japan.
Which telling?
If it were a pure biological reality, it would exist everywhere. Skeptics call it a cultural phenomenon, a fad created by therapists asking leading questions like, can I talk to the angry part of you?
But wait, we have to look at the other side, because you can't just dismiss thousands of suffering people as actors. There are psychologists who fiercely defend the reality of DID, and they have fascinating physical evidence. When they monitor genuine DID patients switching between personalities, they document physiological shifts that a control group of actors simply cannot fake.
That's right. They found sudden, distinct shifts in visual acuity, where one personality needs glasses and the other doesn't. They've documented changes in eye muscle balance, handedness, and even entirely different brainwave patterns depending on which personality is dominant.
So if we accept that it is real, what mechanism causes a mind to shatter like that? Both the psychoanalytic and learning perspectives agree that it is a desperate defense mechanism against unbearable anxiety. A psychoanalyst says the mind splinters to hide unacceptable impulses. A learning theorist says the behavior of splitting reduces anxiety, so it gets reinforced.
But the most harrowing, yet widely accepted clinical view is that DD is an extreme post-traumatic response. The vast majority of legitimate DD patients have histories of severe, torturous, inescapable child abuse. When a child's reality is a living nightmare and they have no physical means of escape, the mind constructs an escape hatch. It creates a secondary personality to absorb the horror so the core self can survive.
It is a dark, heavy, and incredibly contested corner of psychology. We've looked at fractured identities, now we need to transition to fractured emotions. We are moving from the rare extremes to the most pervasive struggle of all, mood disorders. And we start with what is often referred to as the common cold of psychological disorders, depression.
Calling it the common cold captures how widespread it is, but it drastically underplays the severity. It is the leading cause of disability worldwide. But to truly understand depression, we must first recognize its evolutionary purpose. There's a biological wisdom to depression. Just like a cough serves a purpose, to expel toxins from your lungs, a depressed mood after a failure or a loss serves a vital function.
It's like the low fuel light on a car dashboard. When you experience a loss, depression kicks in to force a psychic hibernation. It slows your physical body down, it diffuses aggressive behavior, it restrains risk-taking, and it forces you to retreat, conserve energy, and reassess your life strategy. If you lose a tribal conflict, staying in a depressed, subdued state keeps you from picking another fight you will lose.
But major depressive disorder is when that temporary hibernation becomes a permanent trap. The low fuel light never turns off. Clinically, it is diagnosed when someone experiences at least 5 distinct signs of depression, such as profound lethargy, feelings of worthlessness, sleep disturbances, and a total loss of interest in family, friends, or activities. And these symptoms must last for 2 or more weeks, assuming they aren't caused by drugs or a medical condition.
It is an absolute collapse of the self. There's a quote from a woman named Greta that captures the internal monologue perfectly. She said, I think I am responsible for everything that goes wrong. I think I'm ugly. Nobody wants to be around me. I am a complete failure. It is a lens that turns every positive into a negative and magnifies every flaw until it consumes the person's reality.
Major depression usually runs its course eventually, and people return to their baseline. But for individuals with bipolar disorder, formerly known as manic depressive disorder, the mood doesn't just return to baseline. It violently rebounds to the extreme opposite end of the spectrum. They alternate between the crushing hopelessness of depression and the overexcited, hyperactive state of mania.
If depression is living in slow motion, mania is living in fast forward. When a person is manic, they are wildly euphoric, hyperactive, and wildly optimistic. They feel like they can accomplish anything. They have incredibly little need for sleep. But the danger is that this state is accompanied by heretic judgment. They might blow their life savings on a wild investment, engage in reckless sexual behavior, or speak in a rapid, flighty stream of consciousness that makes no sense.
However, there's a deeply fascinating link between milder forms of bipolar disorder and immense artistic creativity. The manic phase, before it spirals into dysfunction, provides a surge of boundless energy and free-flowing ideas.
The history of art and music is full of examples. Look at the composer George Friedrich Handel. He wrote his masterpiece, The Messiah, during 3 weeks of intense, non-stop manic energy. Or Robert Schumann, who composed 51 distinct works during his manic years and produced absolutely nothing during his depressive years. The disorder is a double-edged sword of creation and destruction.
So how do we systematically explain these mood disorders? Researcher Peter Lewinson laid out several empirical facts that any valid theory of depression must be able to explain. First, depression is accompanied by massive behavioral and cognitive changes. The person becomes inactive and expects failure. Second, it is a global phenomenon. It is widespread everywhere. Third, most major depressive episodes actually self-terminate without professional help. Fourth, stressful life events like job loss or divorce almost always precede the onset.
And the fifth fact is perhaps the most striking. There is a massive gender gap. Compared to men, women are nearly twice as vulnerable to major depression. And this isn't a localized Western trend. The data shows this holds true globally, from the United States to France to Taiwan. Women are significantly more vulnerable to internalizing disorders like depression and anxiety. Men, on the other hand, are more prone to externalizing disorders. They project the distress outward through alcohol abuse, violence, or lack of impulse control.
To explain all of these facts, we have to look at the intersection of biology and cognition. Biologically, genetics are the foundation. The heritability of major depression is estimated to be around 35 to 40%. If one identical twin has bipolar disorder, there is a 70% chance the other will develop it as well.
Researchers are actively hunting down the specific genetic culprits using linkage analysis. They examine DNA across generations of families plagued by severe depression, looking for the specific mosaic of genes that puts people at risk. And we can actually see the physical manifestation of this biology in brain scans. During a depressive episode, overall brain activity severely slows down. The left frontal lobe, which is highly active during positive emotions, goes dark. In cases of severe or chronic depression, the frontal lobes actually physically shrink in volume.
The neurochemical landscape is also radically altered. 2 specific neurotransmitters play a leading role. The first is norepinephrine, which increases arousal and boosts mood. It is severely scarce during depression and overabundant during mania. The second is serotonin, which also regulates mood and arousal and is lacking in depressed individuals.
Here is a fascinating behavioral detail connected to that chemistry. The data shows that a huge majority of people with a history of depression also have a history of habitual smoking. Why? It's not a coincidence. Nicotine is a stimulant that temporarily increases norepinephrine and gives a quick mood boost. Depressed individuals are instinctively, subconsciously self-medicating their neurochemical deficit.
Exactly. And modern medical interventions, like SSRI antidepressant drugs, work by targeting this exact system. They block the reuptake of serotonin or norepinephrine, leaving more of it available in the neural synapses to elevate mood. Even simple physical exercise acts as an intervention by naturally increasing serotonin levels.
But depression isn't just a chemical imbalance, it is a cognitive trap. The social cognitive perspective looks at how the way we think fundamentally alters our mood. Depressed people operate with intensely negative assumptions. They minimize every accomplishment and magnify every failure. And this cognitive trap is deeply rooted in learned helplessness.
Think back to the concept of learned helplessness. When an animal or a human repeatedly experiences unavoidable, inescapable failure, they eventually stop trying. They learn that they are helpless. They become passive, withdrawn, and depressed. Susan Nolan-Hoeksema, a prominent researcher, suggests that women may be more vulnerable to depression because they have a greater cultural tendency to ruminate. Rumination is overthinking. It's endlessly rehashing negative events and dwelling on the pain without taking action.
Let's explore exactly how rumination builds a depressed mind through a concept called explanatory style. Explanatory style is simply how you internally explain a failure or a painful event. Let's use the example of going through a bad breakup.
A person with a healthy coping style explains the breakup by externalizing and minimizing the damage. They might say, "This hurts, but the pain is temporary. I miss them, but my life is still rich with friends and school. And honestly, it takes 2 people to make a relationship work. We just weren't a fit."
Now, contrast that with a depression-prone explanatory style. They explain the exact same breakup using 3 toxic attributions. First, they view it as stable. I will never get over this. The pain will last forever. Second, they view it as global. Without this person, I can't do anything, right? My whole life is ruined. And third, they view it as internal. It was entirely my fault. I am unlovable and flawed. Stable, global, and internal attributions are the absolute recipe for severe depression. You are convincing yourself that the misery is permanent, all-encompassing, and entirely your fault.
These negative cognitions create a self-perpetuating vicious cycle. It operates in 4 predictable steps. Step 1. You experience a stressful event, like rejection or a major failure. Step 2. You filter that event through a ruminating, pessimistic, explanatory style. You tell yourself you are a permanent failure. Step 3. That internal monologue generates a profoundly hopeless, depressed mood.
And step 4 is where the trap snaps shut. The depressed mood changes your behavior. You become lethargic, withdrawn, and often highly complaining and negative. And what does that behavior do? It circles right back to step 1. Being withdrawn and constantly complaining pushes your friends and family away, which elicits actual rejection. The depression actively creates the very rejection and failure it fears. It feeds itself.
It is a brutal, agonizing loop. But understanding it as a loop is also the key to treatment. Because it is a cycle, it can be broken at any point. Right. You can break it by forcibly changing your environment, by undergoing cognitive therapy to rewrite that negative self-talk, or by forcing yourself to engage in positive physical activities that alter your brain chemistry.
Okay, if depression is the common cold, widespread and painful, but often recoverable, we are now moving to what many consider the most devastating of all psychological disorders: schizophrenia. If depression is a fractured emotion, schizophrenia is a literal split from reality.
It is vital to clarify the terminology here immediately because popular culture gets this wrong constantly.
Yeah.
Schizophrenia literally translates to split mind, but it does not mean multiple personalities like DND. It refers to a mind that is split from reality. The person is detached from the shared human experience. It affects about 1 in 100 people worldwide, transcending cultural borders, and it typically strikes as young people transition into adulthood.
The symptoms are profoundly disorienting. They are characterized by disorganized thinking, disturbed perceptions, and inappropriate emotions and actions. Let's look at the thinking first. It is fragmented, bizarre, and illogical. There is a documented patient named Maxine who famously said, "I'm Mary Poppins. Is this room painted blue to get me upset? My grandmother died 4 weeks after my 18th birthday." Her ideas are completely unmoored from each other, jumbled into what psychiatrists call a word salad.
And this word salad is often driven by delusions. Delusions are deeply entrenched, false beliefs that defy all logic. They usually manifest as delusions of persecution, believing the CIA is hunting you, for instance, or delusions of grandeur, like Maxine believing she is Mary Poppins.
But how does the brain get so disorganized? What is the mechanism? It seems to be a total breakdown in selective attention. Right now, as you listen to this, your brain is filtering out the hum of the refrigerator, the feeling of your socks, the traffic outside. You are selectively attending to the audio. People with schizophrenia often lose this capacity entirely. Their sensory filters break. So a tiny irrelevant stimulus, like the groove on a brick wall, suddenly demands their full cognitive attention, derailing their train of thought entirely. It's like trying to listen to one conversation in a crowded stadium where every single voice is broadcast at the exact same volume.
In addition to disorganized thoughts, they suffer from disturbed perceptions, specifically hallucinations. A hallucination is a sensory experience without sensory stimulation. While they can be visual, they are most frequently auditory. The patient hears voices that are not there. These voices often give demands or make vicious, insulting remarks. Imagine the terror of being trapped in a reality where the unreal seems entirely, undeniably real.
And finally, we see highly inappropriate emotions and motor behavior. Maxine, the patient we mentioned earlier, laughed uproariously when recalling her grandmother's death. She cried when others laughed. Other patients might lapse into a flat affect, which is a zombie-like state of complete emotional emptiness, showing absolutely no reaction to anything.
Their motor behavior can be equally erratic. They might engage in senseless compulsive acts, like continuously rubbing their arm for hours. Or they might exhibit catatonia, a state where they remain rigid and utterly motionless for hours, completely unresponsive to the outside world, before suddenly becoming wildly agitated.
Schizophrenia isn't just one monolithic thing, though. It's a cluster of disorders with varying presentations. Clinicians categorize the symptoms into 2 distinct buckets: positive and negative. And we aren't talking about good and bad here. Positive symptoms refer to the presence of inappropriate behaviors, the hallucinations, the word salad, the bizarre delusions. These are things added to reality. Negative symptoms refer to the absence of appropriate behaviors, the toneless voices, the expressionless faces, the rigid catatonia, the social withdrawal. These are things subtracted from normal human functioning.
We also categorize the disorder by how it develops, which dictates the prognosis. When schizophrenia develops slowly over a long period of time, what we call chronic or process schizophrenia, it is heavily characterized by the negative symptoms of withdrawal. The prognosis for recovery is unfortunately very poor.
But when previously healthy people develop schizophrenia rapidly, often as a sudden reaction to extreme life stress, which is called acute or reactive schizophrenia, they predominantly display positive symptoms like hallucinations. And crucially, their prognosis is much better. They are far more likely to respond to medication and recover.
Speaking of medication, the research on the brain abnormalities causing schizophrenia is some of the most compelling in all of psychiatry. Let's look at the neurochemistry. When researchers examined the brains of schizophrenia patients posthumously, they found a startling abnormality, a 6-fold excess of receptors for the neurotransmitter dopamine, specifically the D4 receptor.
Let's explain what that means. If dopamine is the signal, the receptors are the radio antennas picking up the signal. If you have 6 times as many antennas, your brain is over-amplifying the signal. This hyper-responsive dopamine system acts as an amplifier for brain signals, creating the overwhelming positive symptoms like hallucinations and paranoia.
The clinical proof for this is undeniable. Drugs that act as dopamine antagonists, meaning they block those D4 receptors, successfully reduce the positive symptoms of schizophrenia. Conversely, drugs that flood the brain with dopamine, like cocaine or amphetamines, will dramatically intensify the hallucinations and delusions.
But dopamine is only half the story. Blocking it doesn't fix the negative symptoms, the withdrawal and flat effect. For that, researchers point to impaired activity of glutamate, another critical neurotransmitter. And when we look past the chemistry to the actual physical structure of the brain, the abnormalities are stark.
Brain scans of individuals with schizophrenia often reveal abnormally low brain activity in the frontal lobes, which are essential for reasoning, planning, and problem solving. Furthermore, PET scans taken while patients are actively hallucinating show that core regions of the brain, particularly the thalamus, which acts as the sensory router for the brain, become vigorously abnormally active. It is as if the brain is intensely processing sensory data that doesn't exist.
And structurally, it gets even more pronounced. Multiple studies have found enlarged, fluid-filled cavities in the brains of schizophrenic patients, accompanied by a corresponding shrinkage and thinning of cerebral tissue, particularly in the cortex and the thalamus. It is fundamentally a physical disease of the brain.
Which leads to the ultimate question. What causes the brain to develop these profound abnormalities?
This is where we get to what I think is the most fascinating, mind-bending fact in this entire discussion. It's a theory called the fetal virus hypothesis. It is a brilliant example of epidemiological sleuthing. Researchers started looking for macro patterns, asking, are people born in densely populated areas where viruses spread incredibly easily at a higher risk for schizophrenia? The answer was yes. Then they asked, are people born during the winter and spring months immediately after the fall-winter flu season at a higher risk? Again, the answer was yes, about a 5 to 8% higher risk.
These correlations led to a groundbreaking study in California. Researchers took blood samples that had been drawn from pregnant women decades earlier in the 1950s. They analyzed those samples and then tracked down the children born from those pregnancies decades later. They found a stunning causal link. If the mother had elevated antibodies indicating she had contracted the flu, specifically during the second trimester of her pregnancy, her child's risk of developing schizophrenia later in life tripled.
It's astounding. The leading theory is that either the viral infection itself or the mother's intense immune response to fighting off the virus somehow disrupts or impairs the delicate neural development of the fetus's brain during that critical second trimester window.
But we must add the crucial caveat. 98% of women who get the flu in their second trimester have children who do not develop schizophrenia. The virus alone is not enough. There must be an underlying genetic predisposition.
And the genetic data proves that vulnerability exists. The statistics are clear. In the general population, your odds of developing schizophrenia are 1 in 100. If you have a sibling or a parent with the disorder, your odds jump significantly to 1 in 10. And if you have an identical twin with schizophrenia, your odds are nearly 1 in 2.
But the twin studies reveal a detail that perfectly synthesizes our understanding of nature versus nurture. Identical twins share 100% of their DNA, but they don't always share the exact same prenatal environment. About 2/3 of identical twins share a single placenta in the womb, meaning they share the exact same blood supply and the exact same exposure to any maternal viruses.
The other 1/3 of identical twins have separate placentas. So researchers looked at the data. Identical twins who shared a placenta have a 60% chance of sharing the schizophrenia diagnosis. Identical twins who had separate placentas, who had the exact same DNA but different prenatal environments, only have a 10% chance. It is the ultimate, undeniable proof of the biopsychosocial model. Schizophrenia requires a genetic vulnerability that must be triggered by an environmental factor, like a prenatal virus or severe oxygen deprivation at birth. Nature provides the combustible material. Nurture strikes the match.
That perfectly sets up our final category of disorders. We're looking at conditions where people don't lose touch with reality like in schizophrenia, and they aren't incapacitated by the deep despair of depression. Instead, they exhibit inflexible, enduring, and socially maladaptive behavior patterns that fundamentally impair their ability to function in society. These are the personality disorders.
The DSM categorizes these into 3 distinct clusters. The first cluster features anxiety, such as the avoidant personality disorder, where a person is so fearful of rejection they isolate entirely. The second cluster features eccentric or odd behaviors, like the schizoid personality disorder, marked by a profound disengagement from social relationships. And the third cluster features dramatic, emotional, or impulsive behaviors. This includes the attention-seeking histrionic personality disorder and the self-focused, empathy-lacking narcissistic personality disorder. But we need to zero in on the most heavily researched and arguably most destructive of them all, antisocial personality disorder.
Historically, individuals with this disorder were referred to as sociopaths or psychopaths. It typically affects males, and the defining characteristic is a chilling, profound lack of conscience for wrongdoing, even toward friends and family members. The warning signs usually manifest early, before age 15, as the child might begin lying, stealing, fighting, or displaying unrestrained cruelty to animals. About half of these children continue these behaviors into adulthood, becoming highly irresponsible, manipulative, and often criminal adults.
It is the absolute absence of empathy. There is a terrifying example of this involving Henry Lee Lucas, a notorious serial killer who confessed to hundreds of murders. When a psychiatric interviewer asked him about his horrific crimes, Lucas displayed zero emotion. He simply stated, "Once I've done a crime, I just forget it." His accomplice, Elwood Toole, described the act of killing as being like smoking a cigarette, like another habit. They view human beings not as people, but as objects to be used and discarded without a shred of remorse.
The clinical question is, how does a human brain become capable of such cold detachment? Biologically, there is a distinct genetic vulnerability that presents as a fearless, almost dangerously unaroused approach to life.
Researchers have documented this brilliantly. If you take a normal person and tell them they are about to receive a painful electric shock, their autonomic nervous system goes into overdrive. They sweat, their heart races, they excrete massive amounts of adrenaline. But if you take individuals with antisocial personality disorder, even teenagers before they've committed any major crimes, and put them in that exact same stressful situation, they show significantly lower levels of autonomic arousal. They simply do not feel fear, anxiety, or stress the way a normal brain does.
And this deficit is visible in their brain structure. The neuroscientist Adrian Raine conducted PET scans on convicted murderers with antisocial personality disorder. He found significantly reduced activity and essentially 11% less tissue in the frontal lobes. The frontal lobe is the brain's braking system. It is responsible for controlling impulses, long-term planning, and inhibiting aggressive behavior. Their brakes are fundamentally defective.
But, and this is a massive but, biology is not destiny. Just because you have a genetic fearlessness and a sluggish autonomic nervous system doesn't mean you are destined to become a serial killer. If you take that biological profile and place it in a supportive, challenging, structured environment, that lack of fear might be channeled into becoming a star athlete, a heroic firefighter, or a daring CEO. The genes put you at risk, but the environment determines the outcome.
Adrian Raine proved this interaction in a landmark study of Danish men. He tracked both their biological risk factors at birth and their family backgrounds, specifically looking for poverty and instability. He found that the men who had only biological risks or only a background of poverty had relatively normal rates of criminal behavior. However, the men who belonged to the biosocial group, meaning they possessed both the biological vulnerability AD, were raised in poverty and maltreatment, had double the risk of committing criminal acts.
A separate 25-year study by researcher Avshalom Caspi found the exact same thing regarding a gene that alters neurotransmitter balance. The gene alone didn't cause violence, but the gene combined with severe childhood abuse almost guaranteed violent behavior. Nature and nurture dancing together to shape the mind.
Which leads us to pull all the way back and look at the biggest picture of all. Who in our society is vulnerable to psychological disorders, and what role does our environment play in driving those statistics?
The numbers are humbling. The National Institute of Mental Health estimates that 26% of adult Americans suffer from a diagnosable mental disorder in any given year. And when the World Health Organization studied 20 different countries, the United States actually had the highest rate of reported mental disorders of all of them.
When you look for macro correlations to explain these numbers, one factor towers above the rest: poverty. The incidence of serious psychological disorders is doubly high among individuals living below the poverty line. But this creates a classic chicken and egg dilemma for sociologists and psychologists. Does the stress of poverty cause the psychological disorders, or do the debilitating effects of psychological disorders drive people into poverty?
The reality is it's a brutal two-way street. A debilitating disorder like schizophrenia can undeniably destroy a person's ability to hold a job, driving them into poverty. But the relentless stress, the trauma, the demoralization, and the lack of resources that come with living in poverty can clearly precipitate and trigger disorders, especially depression, anxiety, and substance abuse.
The power of the environment to heal psychology was proven beautifully by a study of Native American children in North Carolina. Researchers were tracking behavioral problems in a deeply impoverished community. Suddenly, a change in economic policy, the opening of a casino, moved a significant portion of those families above the poverty line almost overnight.
And the results were incredible. When the economic stress was removed, the children in those newly financially stable families exhibited a 40% decrease in behavioral problems. The children whose families remained in poverty showed no improvement. By modifying the environment and removing the crushing weight of poverty, they literally healed the psychology of the children.
It is a powerful reminder that while we cannot easily edit our DNA, we have immense power to alter the environments that trigger these vulnerabilities.
We have journeyed through some incredibly heavy, dark, and complex material today. From the suffocating grip of anxiety and depression to the fractured realities of dissociation and schizophrenia and the cold void of antisocial personality disorder.
It is heavy terrain. But I think it is essential to remember that despite the dark subject matter, the overarching narrative of psychology is one of profound hope and resilience. Most major depressive episodes do self-terminate. Therapeutic treatments and neurochemical interventions are advancing every single day. We must remember that many of the most highly successful, empathetic, and impactful figures in human history lived with profound psychological disorders.
Abraham Lincoln is a perfect example. He endured severe, debilitating periodic depression throughout his life, yet he harnessed that deep emotional well to lead a nation through its absolute darkest hour with unmatched empathy and resolve. The human mind is fragile, yes, but it possesses incredible recuperative powers.
And that resilience is what makes studying the abnormal so fundamentally important to understanding ourselves.
Well said. And on that note, we want to deliver a warm thank you from the Last Minute Lecture team for joining us on this journey. We hope this deep dive has helped clarify the incredibly complex, often murky waters of human psychology. Thank you for listening.
But before you go, I want to leave you with one final, provocative thought that builds directly on the schizophrenia genetic research we discussed. Scientists at major research centers are currently working toward a goal of being able to unambiguously diagnose psychiatric disorders based entirely on DNA sequencing. If they achieve this in the future, what happens next? Will future parents routinely screen embryos to discard those with genetic predispositions for depression or schizophrenia? And if we successfully edit out all genetic vulnerability to mental illness from the human race, what else might we inadvertently lose? Would we accidentally erase the very neurodiversity that gave us Handel's glorious music, Darwin's world-changing theories, or Lincoln's profound empathy? It's something to think about.